Welcome to another refreshing morning in the nation's capital and to the first Big Thinking lecture of 2018. It is wonderful to see all of you here this morning. My name is Gabriel Miller, and I am the Executive Director of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences. We represent about 90,000 researchers and graduate students in the humanities and social sciences across Canada, who work in 160 universities and scholarly associations that constitute our membership. To begin, on behalf of all of us, I would like to acknowledge and give thanks for being on unceded Algonquin territory this morning. This morning's talk will take place in English, with simultaneous interpretation available via cell phone. Si vous avez besoin d'interprétation simultanée, les détails se trouvent sur vos tables. Nous avons aussi beaucoup d'écouteurs à l'inscription. Je souhaite remercier l'honorable Greg Fergus, notre député parrain de la série. C'est grâce à M. Fergus que ces événements peuvent se tenir dans ce magnifique restaurant du Parlement. We also want to thank our friends and partners at the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council for their continued and significant support of the Big Thinking series. The Big Thinking lecture series is committed to bringing ideas in the humanities and social sciences to Parliament Hill, creating opportunities for researchers to challenge and inspire policymakers, citizens, academics, students, and community members on the critical questions of our time. Today's lecture on trade and human rights brings up a timely question. What is Canada's role? It is a question that many of us have asked, given the importance of trade in the Canadian economy and in this government's agenda. Of course, Canada-US relations loom large. Je suis heureux que nous avons Professeur Aaronson et Leblond avec nous aujourd'hui pour nous lancer dans la discussion. Their research expertise and policy insights will be invaluable. Susan Aaronson is Research Professor of International Affairs at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs and Senior Fellow with the Centre for International Governance Innovation in Canada, an established scholar with numerous authored books and articles on international and digital trade, human rights, and good governance. She is also a frequent speaker on the public understanding of globalization issues and international economic developments. Notably, she authored a digital trade strategy for Canada in NAFTA. Patrick Leblond is the CN Paul M. Tellier Chair on Business and Public Policy, Associate Director and Associate Professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. He is also Senior Fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation. An expert on economic governance and policy, with a particular focus on Canada, North America, and Europe, he has published extensively on financial and monetary integration, banking regulation, including the fallout from the 28 economic crisis, as I was hearing about this morning, international trade, and business government relations. Please join me in welcoming Susan and Patrick this morning. Bienvenue.
Everybody, and thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate this invitation, and it's great. This is our first talk together, right?
It is, actually.
Yeah, so hopefully we'll speak English and be clear, but let's see what you think at the end of this. So thank you so much for welcoming us, and thank you to the organizers. So as you can see, we're going to talk about Canada's role here. Excuse the blurry PowerPoint. So I just want to put this in context because there's a lot happening in terms of human rights. And if you are a professor and use PowerPoint, you should never do this. There's way too much stuff here. But that's the problem, I think. You know, there's so much that is going on that sets the context. So rather than, you know, go over through all of this, I just want you to think about that the context really matters in terms of the ability of any country to push human rights. So we shouldn't hold Canada too hard if Canada is unable to achieve the objectives of the progressive trade agenda. But it should try, right? So, okay. Canada is leading in this regard, and I'd say more than the EU. But I think it needs to think a little bit, policymakers need to think a little bit harder about how and if it's sufficient. Like, why these human rights given all of the human rights and what you can do with trade policy. Okay, so also you need to think about, as a demandeur nation, you need to think about the capacity of the targeted nations. For example, Colombia, okay, which I think about a lot because Colombia is a country that's growing rapidly, has immense post-conflict human rights problems, and doesn't have the governance capacity to consistently advance human rights. So you need to think about the kind of policy expertise that is needed and how a government such as Canada can help to build that expertise. Okay, the other thing I think we need to think about is this is something that I struggle with other scholars to talk about, which is when we talk about human rights, we're always talking about the supply side of this. But there is a demand side, and that is people. And we rarely talk about how can trade policy empower people. And yet, Sylvia Ostry, who you may know of, she was Deputy Trade Minister. She had a lot to do with NAFTA and the GATT, and she was also a professor at the University of Toronto who taught me everything I know about trade. Frankly, she did a lot to advance human rights because she pressed for what I'd call due process transparency and political participation provisions in trade agreements that could help increase the demand for human rights by empowering people, okay? And so we need to think about how we can use trade agreement to bolster the local inherent demand for human rights. And yet we never talk about that. It's all about what we can do to change policymaker behavior. Okay, so we have these expectations about what trade can do, both the incentive of expanded trade through a trade agreement and the disincentive when we use sanctions. And the truth is, it's going to change over time what you can do. It's not like it's a snapshot and that's the end result. So I just want to give you the example of labor rights in Mexico, where, you know, there were aspirational provisions in a side agreement to NAFTA, okay? And we have seen some improvement in labor rights. And one of the most important things that we've seen is on the supply side, the government cares more about labor rights. And on the demand side, I think more unions are doing more, even the unions that are in cahoots with the government or with business owners to undermine labor rights are doing more to represent their workers. And they're challenging things like protection contracts. So we see a more responsive union sector and we see a more responsive government, which in the end should help to improve labor rights in Mexico. Okay, and I also think we need to be very clear about the difference between short-term and long-term and direct versus indirect. Okay, and I think that the fact is that because of NAFTA, I feel very comfortable arguing to you that attention to labor rights has increased, and that in turn will over time make, it becomes over time unacceptable to ignore, for example, labor rights issues. But did the trade agreement do it because of specific language? Probably not. but the sunshine effect, that indirect effect, I think. So now let's talk about an issue that I care deeply about, and I think you should care deeply about, which is artificial intelligence. Okay, so let me define it for you. It's a computer system that performs tasks usually associated with people. And I brought up artificial intelligence because Canada, in particular, again at the University of Toronto, has long been innovative in that sector. And in order to succeed in AI, you need lots of people's data to train the systems, right? And so if Canada wants to continue to be effective in machine learning and other forms of AI, it needs to have trade agreements that allow Canadian AI companies access to tons of people's data, right? And that means that in NAFTA and in CTPP, language related to the free flow of data is really important to those sectors, right? Okay. But it says very little. There is very little language in, let's just take CTPP, related to the privacy rights of those people who supply that data, okay? And another thing is the United States, as part of its NAFTA proposal, it built on TPP, exactly what's in TPP, but it said no participating government, no signatory can require that algorithms be made public because they're proprietary. Well, so in the sense, if you want to challenge the use of an algorithm, you have no such rights. In the digital single market of Europe, in contrast, which is a trade agreement, it's going to go into effect in May, and all the countries of Europe will have free flow of data among them, which they don't have right yet. But under those rules, they have the right to challenge the use of an algorithm. So I'm not saying that's the way for Canada to go. I am saying that's something you need to think about if you care about the relationship between trade and human rights. Okay, so I think Canada needs to think about what it's going to do here. Another example is in our trade agreements, okay, it covers many types of workers, but it does not cover contingent workers. And that's what many of our children will be working as. They are going to work in temporary contracts, okay, and they will not be protected by unions unless we can think of some form of worker organization that is different from a union that can represent them. Okay, because many of the companies that are expanding these days, they are either non-union, okay, or they deliberately work against unions. So we need to think about how we can both encourage employment through trade agreement, but ensure that the rights of those workers who often work without a contract can be protected.
Not for me now. All right, I'll stand up. Sitting still is very difficult. So now that Susan has, what I can say, kind of set the stage and introduced the importance of human rights and in terms of international trade, and certainly in the context of international trade agreements, what I thought I would do is look at, in a way, what's there now and where are we going? Or where should we be going when we're talking about NAFTA, certainly, which is on everyone's mind, but also even in the context of China, given that this government is currently discussing the possibility of negotiating a free trade agreement. There were expectations that we might have an announcement. Last time the Prime Minister was in China. That did not happen. There's been a lot of questions as to whether it's the reason for that was the so-called progressive agenda that did not really fit with the Chinese, and so we'll come back to that. So what I thought I would do is start with what has Canada done so far in terms of human rights, and how does it look like in an agreement? And starting with CETA, which is in a way the latest agreement that Canada signed, considered by most people, the most progressive trade agreement out there, both by Canadians and Europeans. But what we see is that it's still very limited, right? The whole notion of trade agreements and human rights is still pretty much aspirational. So here I was looking at the preamble of CETA. I won't, again, given what Susan has said, that this is not the way you're supposed to do a slide, but we're providing the information. I will not read from it, and I'm being told that the slides would be made available for later, so you can use them as reference. But the idea is that here the members reaffirm their strong attachment to democracy and fundamental rights. Members recognize the importance of security, democracy, human rights. Parties confirm. So you can say here that there's no real commitment in terms of parties shall do this, right? It's very much, well, we're already doing this, and we're going to continue doing this, but the agreement itself is not going to provide any means or teeth to defend human rights, right? So again, it's much more kind of aspirational language that we're seeing. So of course, the big question, and in this context, it's even, some would say, rendered weaker because it's related to third countries, right? So it's basically in terms of doing business, not, let's say, between Canada and the EU, but when Canadian businesses operate in third parties outside of the EU, and then in that context, would it be possible to impose some kinds of sanctions on these businesses? So again, kind of allowing countries to say, yes, we're going to put restrictions on let's say, on firms doing business, let's say Canadian firms doing business in Africa, not respecting human rights. Well, potentially we could prevent them from operating in the EU, or maybe, in terms of public procurement of these types of things, but not so much in terms of respecting human rights within Europe or within Canada. So again, it's the scope is even narrower than we might think. So the big question when we think about human rights more broadly, and then I can speak again also to the question of gender, is whether we should have in trade agreements a human rights chapter, right? That is ultimately enforceable in some way with a state-to-state dispute settlement mechanism, right? That would be in a way to achieve both demand and supply, as Susan said. You would need something that is enforceable, where if it's maybe in the question of labor rights, right, where a member state could say to another member state, well, you are not respecting these standards, and as a result of that, well, could we impose sanctions, right? Because even on the argument, which is often made, that adopting lesser rights or not respecting them provides an unfair competitive advantage, right? After all, this is, the big statement made by President Trump that, the Mexicans are outcompeting Americans, right? Although here in Canada we've said, well, wait a minute, this whole right to work legislation in many states in the US is also kind of unfair competition because it undermines the ability of unions and workers to unite, to go on strike, and actually ultimately get better wages, and which is why what you've seen in the auto sector has been a move south for assembly and auto parts, and not just to Mexico, but to the southern states. And this is something, of course, that the Americans tend to forget. They always think that all the jobs, the auto jobs, have actually gone from, the Rust Belt, Michigan and Ohio and so on, to Mexico. But no, they've actually gone south to Alabama, to Texas, to Tennessee, where salaries are much lower. So it's not just because of NAFTA, it's also because of legislations that have been adopted by governments at the state level. And this is something that, in a way, Canada has brought to the table and saying, okay, well, we're happy to make the labor chapter stronger with stronger languages, but it's got to work for everyone. And so far, from what I've heard, the Americans are not wanting to play ball, certainly on the right to work legislation. So yeah, the idea is that, could there be ultimately a denial of benefits to firms from one of the parties to the trade agreement from the countries to say, well, you have a poor human rights record. Why should we give you, in a way, the same rights as a firm in our jurisdiction if you're not respecting certain standards that we think are important, right? So maybe a denial benefit could say, well, no, you cannot bid on a public procurement contract, for instance, right? Or maybe this investment would not be allowed, so on. So these are examples of what could be done if we really wanted to enforce human rights with international trade agreements, which is controversial, right? Let's not kid ourselves, and Susan talked about that. Some people say, well, no, this, trade agreements should not be dealing with those things. That's not where you do this. They should be dealt with, separately. And there's a reasonable argument to be made, but ultimately also, if trade agreements are about governance, if they're about, people, then maybe they should be linked. And often by linking them, actually we can probably make them more effective in the same way that some people are saying, well, if we want to solve climate change, well, if countries are not respecting their Paris Agreement commitments, well, maybe there should be consequences on the trade side. And if you're starting to affect people's pockets, they might actually change their behavior. In terms of gender, which is something that Canada has put on the table in the NAFTA negotiations, having a gender chapter. There's also the Aboriginal chapter, but I won't get into that. We can talk about that in the Q&A. Again, I was looking, okay, so what have we done so far, right? So CETA, which was the first place that I look, has only one reference to gender, right? So here it says in Article 8 on investment, each party shall accord in its territory to covered investment of the other party, basically not allowing, in a way, discrimination, right? So that if a country where, let's say, Canada and CETA are in Europe, were adopting, I don't know, discriminatory requirements based on gender, there could be, in that case, in the case of investment, a denial of benefit, for instance. But it's very limited, right? And probably would be very difficult also to demonstrate, but it's the only reference. But as some people say, it's a start. Canada-Chile, the revised free trade agreement that Canada signed with Chile last year has actually a gender chapter, right? So this is brand new. This was never done before, but it's, again, aspirational, right? There is no commitment. There is no enforceability. The idea is that both countries, reaffirm, understand, and that kind of language. So not clear exactly how this could, be integrated into NAFTA. Would we want to go further? That's the big question that, in a way, a lot of people are asking. Okay, it's all fine to talk about gender, having a gender chapter, protecting gender rights, but, how are we going to do it, right? Are we just going to have it aspirational, or are we going to go further? Should we want to integrate, for instance, the Canada-US Council for Advancement of Women Entrepreneurs and Business Leaders into NAFTA, right? This was one of the things that was announced last year, should we have it within NAFTA and bring in the Mexicans, for instance, and therefore allow at least for a broader dialogue in the context of trade. So that could be an improvement that could go into a NAFTA gender chapter. Then do we want to go further? Do we want binding language that makes it enforceable under Chapter 20, again, with state-to-state dispute settlement? Do we want to allow, in a way, this is kind of, denying free trade, if you want, the benefits to firms that do not protect gender equality at home or abroad, right? If you want to push gender equality within companies, start denying them benefits. That's going to, focus the minds. Now, politically, would that fly? That's a different question. Should the trade agreement allow for discrimination in favor of women-owned businesses in terms of public procurement, for instance? Right? So if the idea, of course, of free trade is that everyone is supposed to bid equally and there's no discrimination in favor of one firm or another on the basis of nationality, well, could we actually put into the agreement language that would say, okay, fine, in terms of nationality, no discrimination. You know, any Mexican, American, or Canadian company can bid on a public procurement contract, let's say here in Canada, but the agreement will allow discrimination in favor of women-owned businesses or Aboriginal businesses, for instance, and that cannot be challenged by another company. So in a way, you don't have discrimination on the basis of nationality, which is in a way what free trade agreements are about, but you could have it in terms of human rights to some extent, right, to favor certain groups. You know? And certainly this is something that is talked about. What in terms, Susan talked about AI and in a way the digital revolution. We've heard from the 6th round of negotiations in NAFTA that apparently the digital trade chapter is 90% completed. We'll see if in the next round in Mexico there will be an agreement, except that we don't know what's in it yet. But we can suspect that the model that has been used for that chapter is the e-commerce chapter. I don't know if it's been renamed in the CPTPP as a digital trade chapter, but the Trans-Pacific Partnership, given that this was the agreement that went furthest in terms of digital trade and data flows, probably that's where the three parties started. And there, the idea, of course, as again Susan mentioned, is that you want to allow the free flow of data across countries, across the members, for businesses and all that. You want to, the whole idea is to prohibit obligations for data localizations and limits in terms of market access, in a way like we're seeing very much in China. And make sure that there's not an abuse of, by governments to say, oh no, we have to limit data flows, we have to prevent data from leaving, data from coming, companies from offering their cloud services, et cetera, for security and privacy reasons, right? So you want to have kind of a blanket, which is in a way what the Europeans are doing, and say, okay, we're going to protect privacy very strongly, but within that protection, there's going to be free flow. And the Europeans are actually quite clear about this, that they're going to export their model. So if you want in on the EU digital markets, you got to play by our rules, right? Which is interesting that in CETA, the e-commerce chapter, basically almost nothing, which is quite interesting for what is supposedly the most progressive agreement out there. The digital chapter, if you want to call it that, is empty, pretty much. There's very little out there, which is still, I'm not sure why, and maybe there's some people in the room who would know that. But the big question is then, like in TPP, there's the provision that says, well, for legitimate public policy objectives, we can allow derogation. And the big question is, what are those going to be, right? The Chinese will tell you that, our policies are legitimate, right? We need to ensure public safety, security, privacy, not clear, and who's going to challenge that, right? Who's going to say, oh, security, no, this is actually protectionism to favor your firms, right? And so we're going to need a lot more clear language and standards as to what is legitimate and what is not, and when is it okay to protect the privacy or the security of your country and your people, and when is it actually protectionism that makes it harder for some companies to access data and develop the AR software, et cetera, especially for smaller countries like Canada, where if data is the most important thing, but we don't have access to it because it's somewhere else and it's blocked, how do we deal with this? What does this mean for free trade with China? Well, obviously, when we're talking about human rights, it's a huge challenge. Is it what's blocking right now the movement forward in terms of the negotiations with China? Not clear. But we know that it's going to be a very hard sell. Labor rights, probably not impossible. Gender and human rights, much harder. be very surprised if the Chinese would accept anything than just very broad statements. Digital trade is going to be another challenge, right? We know that the Chinese are protecting their markets, and not just for secure reasons, but also to benefit their own firms and developing in a way their own regime on that. So how if we do eventually negotiate a free trade agreement and we're pushing for a digital trade chapter, how is that chapter going to allow Canadian firms to break the Great Firewall and then bring back, if they're there, the data and the information in a way so that you have free trade in services, for instance. So the challenge certainly for Canada is how are we going to make headway on this? And the big issue is we're unlikely to do it alone, right? And this is also what Susan was referring to, is that we can play a leadership role, we can put ideas out there, but relatively we're still a small player. And in that, well, we're going to need, if we want to push the progressive agenda, the human rights agenda, as it relates to trade, well, we're going to need our partners and our bigger partners. And certainly, who are they? Well, the Europeans, who share a similar agenda, and ideally the Americans. Although right now it's not clear that to what extent the US government is willing to push that, but if we're going to go to the Chinese, there's going to have to be a much more collaborative approach than just Canada trying to convince the Chinese that, hey, let's do a trade agreement, and you know what, let's open up digital trade, and let's agree on human rights standards and these kinds of things. I think it'll be a very hard sell. And then finally, I guess the big questions that we have to ask ourselves, and these are the things that Susan and I are thinking about, and we don't have the answers yet, is what kind of incentives do we give these other countries to move a progressive and human rights agenda, and for them to accept that maybe this is something that should be put in trade agreements or at least on side agreements, and both looking at carrots and sticks, and how do we do this. So I guess I'll leave you with those questions, and if you ask us for answers, we're still in the process of thinking about it, but at least we're putting it out there, and thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Susan and Patrick. Merci de ces réflexions, Susan et Patrick. Nous invitons maintenant les gens à poser des questions. Veuillez utiliser le microphone au centre de la salle. So there's a microphone right there in the middle of the room. Please feel free to ask questions or make comments in English or French, but whichever language you use, please identify yourself and try to keep your questions short. Sir, please go ahead.
Rule Amder. I write for the West Quebec Post, and a couple of questions occur to me with regard to the presentation today. First of all, in terms of China, it seems to me that the kind of arrangements that have been made with China have tended to be fairly one-sided. For example, we return to China individuals who have been corrupt in China and have fled to Canada. On the other hand, we don't seem to be having much luck on getting some Canadians returned from China from prison. I think specifically of Imam Khalil, who's been in prison there for quite some time. The other thing that you haven't mentioned is our dealings with Saudi Arabia, selling them what Mr. Trudeau has called jeeps, and that have been used both in attacking their own citizens and also in attacking neighboring countries. So I wonder if you have some reflections on these matters.
Should I take this one?
Go for it.
I don't have much to say. In the first case, these are consular issues. of which I'm certainly not an expert, and I wouldn't want to comment on the decisions that have been made or not made in context. Certainly dealing with certain countries where their idea of the respect for human rights might be different than ours is a challenge, as I mentioned with China. But in this case, this, as far as I'm concerned, these stand outside of trade agreements. Now, if you want to put it in, and that was a big question, is how far do we want to go? And you want to say, okay, well, if country is not respecting certain human rights, and then we judge that they're not, and we do have a free trade agreement, then is that a way where sanctions could be imposed or something like that? Possibly, but then at what cost? These are the kinds of questions that we have to have ourselves, where we say, okay, well, if and even getting there would be certainly a challenge with certain countries, and certainly, namely China. On the exports of certain products, this is a Canadian decision. It's not about free trade, and it's ultimately this is for the government to decide whether it allows the export of certain military products and where. And again, this is not an area where I have particular expertise, so I don't want to go and mention that. But again, it's not an issue of free trade per se, right? It's a decision where we license exports, and we have to decide whether there's the economic benefit of selling military products, and then what are the human rights or other issues attached to that. And then it's for the government and society to decide how far, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable.
Can I add something to that? From 2007 to 2010, I was the outside human rights advisor to Ford Motor Company. And in that time, Ford was under significant criticism because it would sell its trucks to the army in Brazil, and the Brazilian army would be somehow indirectly complicit in transporting people who were essentially slaves in Brazil. And so I can't say that Ford came up with a good solution, but here's how I think it's important that we think about it. So Ford, you want to always, with business, incentivize them, the executives, to think about human rights, to think about the direct and indirect spillovers. And remember, these days, the value for a company like Ford or Bombardier is in the service that's provided with that product, right? The money that comes for the product itself is a tiny little part of that long-standing relationship. So what you get over time is leverage and influence. And so in some ways, having the sale to a repressive state, okay, gives you much more leverage and influence in this world, because Ford could, or Bombardier could, always withhold the data that the government may need. Let's just call it Saudi Arabia for a jet engine. May need over time to repair it, to service it. You have much more leverage because it's the data where the value is over time. So I would say we need to figure out, and none of us as scholars or policymakers are there yet, how do you maximize that leverage so that you're interventionist, but in a way that builds norms? And it's really hard to do. I'm not smart enough to think about it. Maybe Patrick is. But that's how we're going to have to think about it. And that's why the data side of this is so important. It's not the good that's sold that matters. It's the long-term relationship that's built on that data. And it's totally going to change foreign policy.
Thank you for this conversation, Elizabeth May, Member of Parliament for Saanich Gulf Islands. And it was Patrick's comment about maybe we should put things in trade agreements that have to do with climate that prompted me to get to the mic to say we used to be able to do that. It's been decades, and let me just say that I think at a larger level of abstraction, the modern era of trade agreements is all about a rebalancing of the relative power and sovereignty of the state versus the power of corporate actors, with a shrinking of the power of the state and a growth of corporate rule. In 1987, when we negotiated the Montreal Protocol to protect the ozone layer, there were sanctions to ensure that the many state parties, the whole world, would in fact stop producing chlorofluorocarbons. And if any state didn't, all other states were empowered to take trade measures against a violating state. Only a decade later, in '97 in Kyoto, we were told trade sanctions would not be part of this agreement. What happened in between, of course, was the creation of the World Trade Organization and the general position that environmental agreements should not be allowed to get in the way of trade. The NAFTA moment of Chapter 11 adds another piece to this, allowing for the first time foreign corporations to have superior rights to domestic corporations to do such things as filing an investor-state complaint if, and in secret, certainly the Canada-China investment treaty is completely secret still. CETA represents a new level of openness, but with the same principles, foreign corporations have more power than domestic corporations, including the ability to say to a state power, state entity, by insisting on these workplace conditions or environmental improvements or banning that toxic chemical, you've heard our expectation of profits and you now owe us money. So I remain to be convinced that trade agreements can assist us because the evidence of the last number of decades is that they've consistently undermined the ability of states to protect the environment, except if the treaty is well designed. I'd say the European Union Treaty is very well designed. They didn't have investor-state agreements there until CETA. So I see investor-state agreements as really toxic to democracy. But I'm happy to have your comments.
I think I'll take that one. I totally agree with you on investor-state, but I disagree with you, politely, on trade agreements empowering multinational corporations. I mean, I agree with you that it sure looks that way. And there's no doubt that that is true for investor-state, and that is an aberration. I think that the Europeans have proposed a solution to that I hope gets adopted. The system needs to be built on precedent. It needs to be multilateralized. You can't have judges who, work for a client and then make a decision. It's crazy. But I can tell you, I do a lot of work, and if I can get funded, I could do more work looking at metrics of human rights and controlling for other factors to see what happens to a particular human right after a trade agreement goes into effect. And here's the difference between you and me on this. You're talking about using sanctions, okay, which is different from a trade agreement. A trade agreement is all about incentives and using market access, if you will, to improve governance. So I see trade agreements as governance agreements. And I agree with your conclusion that we've seen that trade agreements can undermine governance, but it can also do the opposite. So what I see for the human rights that there are decent metrics for that we've looked at, and this would include things like freedom of association and collective bargaining, political participation, in general, over time, and obviously it depends on the country, and it depends on the trade agreement, but what we see is improvements. Now, other human rights decline. And now let me diss my own work. Most of this data is total garbage, but it's what we have because it's incredibly expensive to come up with data sets. And they're all supply-side data. They look at government's respect for human rights. They are not built on surveys that ask, and would people answer honestly, do you really believe that you have freedom of speech in, will Mexicans answer that? Like I'm doing just this thing for EU-Mexico, evaluating the potential impact of that trade agreement. And I don't think we're going to get honest answers to the survey. In fact, we'd be lucky if 300 people answer the survey. So it's garbage in. But nonetheless, we have to just be careful to make a difference between a trade agreement, which is, again, trying to increase market access and use that leverage to change practices. And I can say, in terms of some human rights, we've seen some real improvement, and in terms of governance. And Saudi Arabia would be an example of that, if I may, and then I'll shut up. Saudi Arabia remains an incredibly repressive state, right? And we can't say that its membership in the WTO has led to changes in human rights behavior. But here's what we can say we've seen. we've seen this new guy come in, and I think he's using corruption just like the Chinese to consolidate power. But we've also seen him say and do things that show that he realizes that the oil's going to run out someday, and that he needs to empower his own citizens, including women, so that they can make more of an economic contribution. And I would say that what they've been required to do as a result of the WTO, which is to govern in the sunshine and to allow foreign producers and domestic producers to comment on legislation, to challenge it, that over time filters into the polity as a whole. So you do see changes, but is it direct? Is it indirect? Is it immediate? Is it, is that helpful?
Well, I think we agree that investor-state agreements are an anomaly, but they keep being important to us in trade agreements. But I think we can design trade agreements for better governance. I don't disagree with you on that at all. And I know there's a big lineup. So
Thank you.
I just, exactly. I
Patrick,
think the
briefly.
point that Samay is making is that it's the design of the agreements, right? And certainly on the issue of environment and climate change, yeah, the fact that there's no real teeth to the agreements makes it very difficult. Of course, then yeah, it's all fine. We commit to all these targets, but then what if we don't meet them? Okay, well, naming and shaming, but that's the end of it. Of course, like the Montreal Protocol, if you attach the possibility of trade sanctions in the sense that, well, the fact that you're not respecting that agreement in a way means that it's an unfair competitive advantage if we are doing it. So if we are abiding by the standards and you're not, then could we retaliate through trade sanctions? Well, certainly that would probably get us much further than the current system. And certainly it worked in the case of the Montreal Protocol. And I think then it comes back to this issue of how do we design, or how do we want to design these agreements, and how far are we willing to go. But it's going to be a long process, right? Because there are a lot of countries that don't necessarily share those same views and standards as we do, whether it's on the environment or on human rights and things like that. And sometimes it's the opposite, right? Some other countries want to go further and we don't. And I think that's really the big questions as governments, policymakers, and society that we have to ask ourselves, and how do we work together to achieve those objectives? Absolutely.
Thank you very much. So I think our goal should be to get these three questions on the floor addressed before we leave. We've got about 6 minutes, so if we can do rapid fire, yeah, actually, that might
let's
not
take
be a
all
bad
three
idea.
and then-
Why don't we do that? Why don't you just introduce yourself, ask your question. We'll let all three of you do that, and then we'll let Patrick and Susan respond.
Well, thank you both of you for being here today. I'm Josh Bourne. I'm an intern in MP Bob Zimmer's office. I have a question. You were talking about data trade and digital trade. Does the American changes in regulation regarding net neutrality have any impact on that? If they're closing their pipes a little bit, so to speak, in terms of the flow of data, are Canadian ISPs going to have to pay extra to these American ISPs to ensure that the flow of data remains the same? Or is there any impact there, or am I coming way out of left field here?
Okay, and why don't we take the next two as well, and then we'll have a discussion.
Hi, I'm Nika Moini. I'm a master's student in international economic policy at the Norman Patterson School, and I work on the Iran file at Global Affairs. My question is, if you could design an ideal trade agreement that incorporates gender in a way that has teeth, as you say, what type of provisions would you put in there? Would you maybe make a provision for increased monetary support to female entrepreneurs, or training for women to export, or maybe something concrete about protection of women in the workforce? I'm just curious what type of concrete provisions you would include. Thank you.
Oui, bonjour, je m'appelle Ija, je travaille pour les conseils de recherche en sciences humaines et je suis aussi chercheur en histoire culturelle et politique. Donc tout d'abord, merci pour vos interventions. Je suis heureuse de savoir que des personnes qui participent à l'élaboration de ces accords de libre-échange portent une perspective qui n'est pas seulement économiciste sur ces accords, mais qui essaye de les comprendre aussi comme des projets géopolitiques et culturels. En tant qu'historienne, je pense que c'est important de souligner ça. Ce ne sont pas seulement des projets économiques, mais géopolitiques et culturels. And I'd just like to perhaps trouble a little bit the perspective that Professor Aaronson presented in the first part of this breakfast, because you mentioned two cases, Mexico and Colombia. I happen to be quite familiar with both, and both countries are immersed in quite violent and brutal wars, and the presence of Canadian mining companies has a lot to do with the way in which violence has intensified over the past decades. So I have a lot of trouble seeing how, specifically in Mexico, the trade agreement, NAFTA, has contributed to increasing visibility or attention to human rights and specifically to workers' rights. So perhaps if you could comment on that. And then I guess a follow-up and tenuously connected question is how we, if you've thought about how we might try to envision these free trade agreements through the lens of how Canada has crafted treaties with Indigenous peoples, because they're also affecting Indigenous peoples in different parts of the world, and specifically in Latin America. Thank you.
Okay, so questions on the floor. One about on digital and how Canadian ISPs could be affected.
got it.
You've got all three?
Data, gender, and human rights in general and labor rights.
Fire away.
Okay, so on data flow, such an interesting point, and thank you, but it ain't gonna happen. And what I mean by that is there has been, first of all, number one, there was disinformation to the FCC. A lot of the comments that were supposedly received have now been found to have been manipulated. And so there will be another vote, is my understanding. But of course, Ajit Pai and the other Republican commissioners will likely vote again. But Congress has at least 3 bills to revive net neutrality. And you know, that is a very weird term, but the United States cannot be credible, as I think you pointed out, regarding the free flow of data if we do have a 2-tiered system regarding data. So there is no explicit language in trade agreements related to net neutrality, but it is an underlining norm of how the internet works. And the United States it would look totally hypocritical. But believe me, there are plenty of people in Congress that want ICANN to become back again controlled by the US. So it's kind of crazy. Gender.
Well, why don't you answer the question about Colombia?
Okay,
and
so
I'll do the gender part.
again, in terms of human rights, right, I'm looking, I do believe, remember I said, you have to look specifically at each human right, and we don't have good data on a lot of it, but I do think there has been a spillover effect. Policymakers in Colombia and Mexico do more to protect human rights, and I think Colombia is, to me, the most interesting case study, and by the way, some human rights, but not all. If you want to make human rights a priority, it seems to me, and this is something, like I said, I do the EU human rights impact assessments and frankly, it makes me laugh. It's a worthless endeavor because they're not willing to do the real work required to actually improve governance of human rights. So what does that mean? It means lots of foreign aid, lots of incentives, training, but then it also means empowering people and making that a priority. So I don't want to diss the EU, but the things that they say they care about are not binding things. They do give foreign aid much more than the United States does, but Colombia is the one country where all 3 entities, the United States, the EU, and Canada, are putting forward pretty much the same human rights, and they do it so differently, right? Canada fines, the United States sanctions, the EU nothing. And they've all put in a lot of foreign aid. And we do see some improvements for some labor rights, while others, for example, murders of union leaders go on as if nothing has happened. So what does that say? So it says to me that we're not yet doing it right. It's the old, how is as important as what? But to change that takes money. And trade agreements, to their credit or to their horror, are off budget, right? So we try to change economic conditions through incentives. Foreign aid, in contrast, is on budget, and while it may be more popular in Canada than it is in the United States, it's really hard to build a large constituency for that. If you really want to change human rights, you got to really invest in it.
Yeah, so and I guess this follows very well from what Susan is saying. So if we're talking about the ideal agreement, which in the 1 minute that I've left, we're not going to do. But
You can have two.
I can have two. But you know, when we talk about free trade agreements, what are we talking about? You know, ultimately, as Susan has said, we're talking about governance agreements, right? And you know, ultimately, it's about saying, okay, we start from the basis that there is complete free trade in goods and services and ultimately even people. And then we sort of step back slowly, right? We say, okay, well, when is it okay to actually have a derogation on this free trade to maybe impose, you know, oh, we'll exclude that sector, or we'll exclude, you know, those firms, or we'll exclude those people, or those services, or that industry, et cetera. And in order to allow, in a way, for discrimination, because that's exactly what free trade agreements, they're trying to remove discrimination in favor of national, local firms. That's what free trade agreements are saying, right? We're saying our products are no better than your products. We're going to treat them equally, this whole notion of national treatment. So if we're talking about gender, and this is the kind of questioning and thinking that Susan and I are doing. She's done a lot more than I have on this. But you know, how does it work in practice? If you're talking about gender, for instance, and you're putting that in a trade agreement, beyond just having aspirational language that, yes, you know, we're going to protect gender equality and promote it and do these kinds of things, which is all fine and good, but then you don't really need to put that in a trade agreement, right? You can just say it. Yes, exactly. So if you want to put it in the trade agreement and give it some meaning, then it's a little bit like I said. Do you want to allow, for instance, in public procurement, which is a part of a trade agreement, discrimination in favor of women-owned businesses? Not on the basis of nationality, but on the basis of gender or Aboriginal groups. This is when you're starting, you can do that in the context of a free trade agreement and say, okay, fine. Women-owned businesses all across North America can now bid on public procurement projects, and we're going to put a higher value if it's a woman-owned business, and they're going to get more points, and that's going to give them a higher chance of actually getting that procurement. And no other firm from anywhere will be able to say that's unfair and invoke some kind of investor-state dispute settlement, although there's none in public procurement. But you know, if there were one, no, it's like, look, we have it in the trade agreement, it's okay. But then it's no longer, that's where you can go. But you're not going to have, you know, foreign aid and these kinds of, you know, on-budget policies inside of a trade agreement. That's not where they belong. So again, we have to be careful of not trying to throw everything into a trade agreement, because then, of course, it's probably going to be impossible to negotiate and get to a deal in the end. And there are things that, you know, are better done outside of it. But then, you know, it's how do you create that sort of system ultimately, and the kinds of links that you can build, and how do you design those agreements? So there are some cases where you can use the incentives of market access and others to maybe promote gender equality or you know, the Aboriginal groups or human rights more broadly. So it's all a question about the design, but again, also with certain limits, I guess I would say.
Thank you very much. I'm going to say 2 minutes of thanks and look ahead before we finish. But before I do, I'd just like to ask everyone to join me in giving a round of applause to Patrick and Susan. It's always a good sign that we've had a great breakfast when we have to work so hard to answer all the questions before we get out of here. We never have enough time for those kind of questions. I think there were at least a couple of points that we didn't get to discuss in detail, and hopefully, if people are dying to ask something, you may be able to grab Patrick and Susan before they go. Just a couple of words. You know, I think the Canadians, certainly I have been feeling a bit of a roller coaster in the last couple of years about trade. people have felt confusion, they felt frustration, and then they feel anxiety in the wake of the debates that have emerged in our newspapers and on television. And at the best of times, these are difficult agreements for lay people to understand and to follow. And the scarcest and most valuable asset we can have in navigating this is some actual understanding of what's going on and some bit of knowledge. And you've given us that this morning. I'm going to leave better informed, I think, and feeling slightly more able to navigate an incredibly complicated and charged set of issues, and I want to thank you for that. It's been terrific. I assure you we have some nice parting gifts for you, which I'm going to present to you afterwards, so we can spare people having to sit through that. I do want to say merci encore au CRSH pour leur soutien précieux tout au long de cette série. And also thank you to the Honorable Greg Fergus, the parliamentary sponsor of these lectures. Thank you all for joining us for today's Big Thinking. A video of this session will be posted on our website at the Federation for Humanities and Social Sciences, and I think we'll arrange to have the PowerPoint there as well. Be sure to join us here again on March 20th when the Federation joins efforts with the Partnership Group for Science and Engineering to bring you a moderated discussion on Arctic warming, land and communities on the cusp of rapid change. Merci encore et bonne journée à tous. Thank you and have a wonderful day.